So it's been a busy week at Tottenham Hotspur. Mohamed Kudus joined last week for a fee of around £55 million, and Morgan Gibbs-White did look like he was set to be coming in. A lot of confusion sort of delayed the deal, but one thing's for sure is that Mohamed Kudus will be a Spurs player. He already is a Spurs player. He signed, and let's dive straight into it and see, was this a good deal for Spurs? 55 million, 24 years old, Premier League experience. I think it's a good one. So Mohamed Kudus joins for a fee of around £55 million, becoming the first player to join Tottenham Hotspur from West Ham since Scott Parker did so for around 5 million back in the summer of 2011. And in terms of the signing, I'm really excited about this. I think he's the sort of profile that we've been missing, a player that can just take the ball, run at players 1v1, and sort of make something out of nothing, a bit of guile. I mentioned on the last video about maybe Wilson Odobert being that sort of player for Spurs next season in the left wing position. Um, but I think Kudus really is the sort of, I wouldn't say he's a finished product because he's not by any means, but he's a lot more of an accomplished player at the age he is than Wilson Odobert. Admittedly, there's what I think is a 4 or 5 year difference maybe between the two. But Kudus, I'm really excited for it. I know there's been a lot of mixed reviews about Kudus' time in the Premier League. A lot of West Ham fans will say that he was absolutely brilliant in his first season and that he didn't really live up to the expectations in his second season. Some saying that he downed tools. I can see why some would say that, but also I think even if you look at us last year, there's a number of variables um, in football and a lot of stuff which I think sometimes is easy to make a narrative out of, but sometimes the intangibles in football paint a picture that isn't 100% true. I think even if you look at our team last season, towards the end of the season, I won't go as far as to say anyone down tools, but psychologically, you could just see that 2 or 3% had dropped off in the performance and the application in the Premier League. And I wouldn't have looked at any of the Spurs players last year and thought they were particularly down in tools. I think it's just sometimes these things happen in football. You can sort of feel like you're not really going anywhere in certain competitions or under certain managers. And I think if you look at West Ham last year, change of manager, Julian Lopetegui come in, didn't quite um, hit the heights that people thought he would, dismissed halfway through the season, and then Graham Potter coming in. And whilst Potter does play very progressive football, what I'd say is that a lot of his attacking movements are similar in the way, sort of similar to Ange in the way that they like to get to the byline and then cut the ball back for an easy finish, which is probably why they produce a lot of expected goals metrics. But I think a player like Kudus, he's a sort of player which you need to just give license to roam. And I really think that with a manager like Thomas Frank, he's shown how defensively solid they can be at Brentford. And I think if you look at the personnel at Tottenham defensively, I think the starting back four of Porro, Udogie, Van de Ven and Romero, I think is a really good defensive back four. And I think if we can just be a bit more watertight at the back, I think that will allow a lot of players to express themselves and really get the best out of themselves in a Spurs shirt. At least that's the that's the way that I'm seeing it. Some people say that it probably will be a bit more rigid, which is fair enough. They're entitled to their opinions, but in terms of Mohamed Kudus, really excited. Even by some people's standards, a bad season for him last year. Still got 5 goals, 3 assists in 32, which isn't it's not amazing, but it's it's definitely not bad. Um, Obviously, you're comparing that to the season before where he got 14 goals and 6 assists in all competitions the year before in just 10 more games. but also you have to vary in you have to factor in that West Ham were competing on more fronts. They were in the Europa League the season before last. Obviously, weren't in any sort of European football last year. Um, but I think what this last week really has taught everyone outside of Tottenham is that we are a really big club with a really big pool. I think even if you look back at some of the signings Ange made, or whether that was Langer or Ange, remains to be seen. But still, the likes of Radu Dragusin, who turned down Bayern Munich to come to us. Again, there's variable factors in that, such as game time. Also, you've got the likes of Lucas Bergval, who turned down Barcelona to come to us. And Kudus really just digging his heels and saying, I'm not going unless I'm going to Tottenham Hotspur. There's muted interest from the likes of Newcastle and Chelsea, who, if I'm honest, Chelsea seemed like more of a front runner for his signature, or at least more competition for us. Um, but yeah, the appeal really does seem to be there. Morgan Gibbs-White, who I'm sure we'll touch on once that deal's done. Again, similar, saying that he only wants to go to Tottenham. I think if you look at all of the attractions surrounding Tottenham, you know, realistically playing European football at the very least every other season, playing in a huge stadium, playing in the capital of England. I think the foundations have been there for a while to attract these type of players, and I think the Europa League wins maybe. I know, ironically, Ange said about the Stonecutters Creed and that the first 100 attempts, no one sees. You only see the 101st, which, ironically, the 101st game I think I seen on Twitter, which must be true, is that that was Ange's 101st game in Bilbao, and I really starting to feel like with this new sense of investment, we really are not far away from a team that can compete on all fronts. And I know a lot of people have been saying about when Gibbs-White was coming in, they're saying, well, we have Maddison, so why do we need him? But also by the same stretch, when it gets to October, November, and injuries start piling up, people will be saying that we don't have squad depth. So it's six of one, half a dozen of the other, and obviously playing Champions League football. I feel like in the Europa League last year, it was really good for developing some young talents, the likes of Bergval, Mikey Moore, Odebear, even on a bit of a lesser extent, Will Lancashire, Dane Scarlett, Demola Ajayi, all scoring. And I think the difference in quality between the Champions League and the Europa League would mean that these types of players would get, well, the likes of maybe Ajayi, Lancashire, Scarlett, you could even say Mikey Moore, probably get a bit more game time, which is obviously good for their development at their age and it's good experience. But also in the Champions League, there's there's no easy games. It's so cliche, but it really is true. Um, I think as Spurs fans in the Champions League, you've seen the year that we got to the final, Inter Milan, Barca, PSV, all games that really have to turn up. You can't afford to sort of half-ass it and hope that you might be able to nick something because that's a difference in quality when it comes to the Champions League and the Europa League. And I think a lot of it is about perception. So when we were away to Frankfurt last year, maybe it was because we weren't performing well in the league, but Frankfurt was sort of bigged up as this all-conquering European, it's a team with European nous, a bit like a Sevilla, who are just able to get it done. And maybe that was because the perception was there because they'd won the Europa League back in, I think it was 2022. And yeah, I think in terms of Champions League, it's going to be more games from last time we were in it. Um, and it means that the competitive nature of it really does ramp up just in terms of not being able to maybe get out of a group with the likes of 5 or 7 points. It really is down to the best 8 teams going straight through and then the other 16 teams competing to play against those eight. So I think a player like Kudus, he really strikes me as a sort of player that would just want to take on that responsibility. And I think having him in the team will have such a big impact on the other players, even the likes of James Maddison, who I think actually got quite a lot of unfair stick for the season that he had last year. When you think that he scored in the semi-final of the Europa League, scored quite a few goals in all competitions, and I think sometimes the creative burden was forced upon him, and I think that's maybe why we've seen him drop off a little bit towards throughout the stages of the season. Likewise with Kulusevski, who just played far too much football, and I think we're really seeing the impact of that now. Bit of a weird one with his injury because I just described it as a knock, which at the time was it was just like people were like, "Oh, it's another injury, a knock," and it was almost sort of this sort of dismissive. Oh yeah, or of course it's just a knock. Oh, he's going to be out for long term. I've not heard anything since Bilbao about Kulusevski, about how he's going to fit in, when he's going to be back. And he's almost a bit of a forgotten man. And I think someone who was forced to play as much football as he has, now we'd like to think as well with the new injury team that Frank's bringing in, these players, when they come back from injuries, there's not the pressure to be just forced into the team just because they might be able to play. Because especially at the top level of football, that 1 or 2% drop off, any player in the world is possible of that. And as soon as sort of their teeth is shown in terms of them not being up for it for that particular game, they will get picked apart. And it doesn't matter what team you play for, what accolades you've won at top level football. If you're not at the top of your game, then you are going to be punished for it. And I think having the likes of Kulusevski to be eased back in, and then also having the options of the likes of Brennan Johnson, Heung-min Son, Matisse Tell, James Maddison, Wilson Odobert, really, really promising, I think, in terms of squad depth. And I think it's probably the first time in a while that we've got some attacking depth moving forward. And yeah, I'm really, really excited about Kudus. Um, it's one that's definitely going to annoy West Ham fans. I did see on his medical there's something about checking for his heart, and he said that's where Spurs is. Which, come on, mate, you're 24 years old, grow up, essentially. But at the end of the day, he's a Spurs player. He's happy to be here. He wants to be here, and I think he's really, really going to contribute. And in terms of where Spurs go next in the window, um, Morgan Gibbs-White looks like he's going to be the next one. I don't want to touch too much on it until the deal's done, because with all possibility involving Spurs, there's always a chance of things to go tits up. And this whole debacle around Gibbs-White has been relentless. It's sort of been tiring, but I think the deal's going to get done. But just in terms of focusing on Kudus now, I think the fact it was such a controversial move from a West Ham perspective to go to Tottenham, he's going to have that chip on his shoulder to prove a lot of people wrong. And I think the sort of player he is, you've seen it when he was at West Ham. He wants to express himself and he wants to be the star of the team. And don't get me wrong, at Tottenham, it's not always going to be the case where he's going to be the guy, just because of the attacking depth we have compared to West Ham now. But I think we're going to see times this season where Kudus drags us through games. And I guess as well, it takes a lot of pressure off of some of the younger players in the squad. Kudus's versatility to play really anywhere across that three behind the striker if Frank is to go forward with a 4-2-3-1, or even I think when he was playing in Denmark, he even played a little deeper. So it may be whether manager's tactically fluid as Thomas Frank. I think that could be that could be a really, really good addition. Um, he took the number 20. Um, it's a number that I love just because of Dele Alli and of course Fraser Forster just fucking levering it in that League Cup quarter final against Manchester United. But Kudus, I, I think he's gonna cook, as the kids would say. But Kudus, um, I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on him from the outside perspective, and maybe some within Spurs. I know he got sent off last year for pretty much starting on all of our team, but and the West Ham fans are going to be out sharpening their knives, ready for any sort of failing or any mishap that they'll be able to put on social media. And that's not just West Ham fans. Let's be honest, it's all football fans. Do you know what I mean? But yeah, Kudus is here. He's signed. He's training. He's in for pre-season. It's the sort of deal that a lot of Spurs fans have been saying for a while. Not even just in terms of the profile, but getting these Premier League proven, experienced players with that sort of ability to improve and age on their side. I think it's just a really, really smart signing. I really do. Um, we've seen before a lot of Brian Hill, for example, a player who, by all accounts, when we signed him, yes, he wasn't setting La Liga alight, but players with potential. But there's a sort of variables of it's a new country. They might need to adapt to the game. It might take 12 months, that sort of thing. Kudus, I feel like some players are just so good that they're almost like a plug and play. You could drop them into any team, into any league, and they'll play the same. And obviously, it's not as simple as that. But even in a West Ham team that's, if I'm honest, has been struggling for a few years since that Conference League win. Um, Under Moyes, he was absolutely brilliant, especially towards the end of that first season. But yeah, like we said, there's a number of variables with this one. But I think there's a number of variables with this one, but I think by the end of the season, we're going to be looking back at this deal and really, really doffing our cap to the Tottenham recruitment team. Premier League experienced, big money, potential to improve and really kick on to that next level and bring us with him as he goes. Be interesting to see how he's integrated into the team. Brennan Johnson obviously come through a lot of stick last year um, because of his general lack of effectiveness throughout the 90 minutes, despite him popping up with goals that would probably mask over that. And I think even the arrival of Kudus might maybe push Johnson on more to say, but I've just scored a goal in a European final for you, and even I'm not guaranteed a starting position. I think that's the sort of culture we need to create at Tottenham, because that's a winning culture, not where you bring in a player and then you bring in someone who's quite clearly not as good as them, but has the potential to exceed them. I think the only thing that will improve these sorts of players is good, articulate coaching, which I think we'll get under Thomas Frank, and an increase in quality in terms of the depth fighting for positions. Because now I don't feel like there's a huge drop off in some of the options. Even when I look at the likes of fullback, Spence and Porro and a doggy, I think Spence can rival both of them. I think Danso's a good signing. He can sort of push Van de Ven and Romero to be better. And yeah, overall, oddly happy in mid-July with a Tottenham signing and not a lot to complain about. So I guess now all that's left to do is wait and see how this Morgan Gibbs-White debacle plays out, and get ready for this Saturday where I'll be going up to Reading to watch Tottenham versus Reading, Thomas Frank's first game, and see a glimpse of Mohamed Kudus in a Spurs shirt. So until then, I'll love you and leave you, and up the Spurs.